Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 video. We got the new DLC. Yes, my friends, the very kind people over at Paradox have decided to sponsor me here by giving me early access to the Götterdämmerung. This thing. Yes. A brand new DLC for Hearts of Iron 4 that gives us so many fun things. Things that people have been wanting here for quite a while. We have a completely rebuilt Germany, which is just rebuilt from the ground up with all different kinds of features and new special things that are part of the game as well. We have focus trees for Austria, a revamped focus tree for Hungary. We have a new focus tree for Belgium as well as the Congo, so you know I'm going to be exploring all that. But for the purpose of this video, which is sponsored again by Paradox, they told me that I could create one thing, and I wanted to put that out to you all to determine what it is that we do. And by an overwhelming margin, as you can probably guess with the World War II game, the thing that you all really wanted to see was an alternate history Germany and what actually happens with it. So you know what, my friends, let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's create an alternate history scenario for Germany and see just how that plays out with the DLC. January 1936, let's go into it. Now, from the very beginning here, going into the game, there are a couple things that you may notice look a little bit different. There's a special thing right over here that says Land Warfare Facility, and that is because now with the new DLC, we have special research projects with experimental facilities that can go, if you get a scientist such as Karl Heinrich Emil Becker, put him in charge, and hey, do you want to research military engineering vehicles or super heavy howitzers? You could do that. Special projects are now one of the core features of the game, and with these experimental research projects, you could potentially get some really powerful things that are created, and pretty much every major power is going to have access to different ones, and will be able to interfere with the special projects of other nations. Like, you could run straight-up bombing missions and try and destroy the facilities so that they can't research things. You know damn well that we are going to be experimenting with that here in the future. But even though this is a core feature of the game, that is not precisely what it is that we are going to be doing here today. We're going to go ahead and select something like military engineering vehicles and get this started, because this actually gives you armored engineer companies and everything else, which I love. But in our case, though, we're going to be exploring the focus tree for Germany, which has been completely revamped from the ground up. So first off, going into the national ideas and what you can see here for anyone who is curious, the Führer has been debuffed. He's actually been nerfed a little bit. Instead of having political power gain plus 25% from the start, he has only 10%, but also at the same time, if a war breaks out early or anything else like that, you actually get less damage to your war support from casualties, which is something that is fascinating to see here. So he gets one other type of bonus, but then one other type of debuff as well as the fact that also less compliance growth, greater resistance, etc., because that's what happens when you have a mad dictator in charge of things. The big thing, though, that one needs to understand with this DLC, and this is what I'm going to love, I'm going to absolutely love for all future alternate history scenarios that we create, because this actually helps tell a realistic story. MIFO bills. MIFO bills are no longer as powerful, and as time goes on, can actually be something that cripples and punishes the economy of Germany more than anything else. MIFO bills were promissory notes created by Himmler-Schlock to enable the government to fund rearmament, acting through the balance sheet entity of Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft to hide this rearmament from French and British eyes. These bills must be extended for 6-month periods, or their recipients will have to be paid when they fall due. Yes, basically, Germany rearmed itself through promissory notes and loans, and the thing is, if it did not keep conquering everything and taking the gold reserves and whatnot of the states that they took over, they would not be able to continue to fund their economy. The whole economy of Germany, as time went on, was like a giant paper tiger. Yes, it looked really scary when they were producing things for the war machine, but if anything went wrong, and things did go wrong, the whole thing would start to collapse. This is why they needed the gold reserves of Czechoslovakia, why they needed the reserves of Austria, why as they moved further east, they would steal as much as they could out of France, out of Poland, out of the Soviet Union, anything that they could get in order to be able to keep their economy running, they would. But now what happens with MIFO bills is that every single month, the consumer goods factor is going to increase, and the larger it gets, the more penalties are going to be applied, which means we can create so many more scenarios here in the future for alternate history that are realistic, and I love that because it's going to show what would actually happen if, say, Austria or Czechoslovakia resisted Germany. If they didn't go and actually fall to the Reich, how much weaker that makes them. I'm going to show that off here in the future. Anyway, I've been going on about this for a while without actually doing anything, so let's dive into this here with the focus tree. Look at this extensive monstrosity. We have things from developing modern maneuver warfare, expanding the Air Force. We have the whole thing here with the Kriegsmarine. And of course, you have different paths that you could take for an economy, either prioritizing standard economic growth or the 4-year plan and pursuing the path of like autarky. There's also the inner circle mechanic that you have with the Führer, which is something that is fascinating itself when going down different, say, fascist paths. But more importantly than any of that, you have completely revamped political trees and historical paths that you can take with actually things in here now. You can mark in the focus tree specifically what is key historical focuses so that you can know the set path of what is what. This is fascinating and I love it. As you can probably see here from Sudetenland, Fate of Czechoslovakia, Danziger War, and around the Maginot, etc., that all of this here is part of the historical path. The not-so-historical path, though, that is over here. And that's what we're going to be doing today. The question that we're going to ask ourselves for this alternate history scenario is, what if in 1936, right at the point of, say, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, what if it failed? What if this didn't work? And what if instead the German officers revolted against the Führer? This was a very real thing that could well have happened. And if the Allies had gone and resisted, if France and Britain had not backed down and allowed the Rhineland to be remilitarized, there is a decent chance that what would end up happening is that the military elite within Nazi Germany, which were not necessarily loyal to like the mustache man by this time, that they would have actually risen up. There were many, many, many different conspiracies, potential assassination plans, and all different kinds of things that would occur. So if this had failed, that means that the Wehrmacht would be rallied and would fight against the mustache man. Hitler's reign was come to an end. He means to provoke the Western powers by remilitarizing the Rhineland, but doing so will give us the excuse we need to seize power with the help of loyal elements in the Wehrmacht and rally the people of Germany against him. This, my friends, is what we are going to do. We are going to approach this in a realistic alternate history scenario of what would actually happen if Hitler was overthrown in 1936. Well, let's talk about it. First things first, let's go ahead and get our research out of the way. As you can probably tell from this, there are new interesting research things that we have, such as you actually have to research basic fortifications and other things in order to be able to build them now, which is incredibly cool. Also unlocking special project Stronghold Network. We're going to be skipping all that right now because it doesn't really matter, and we're going to go ahead and get our economics out of the way because this is largely what we are going to have to deal with here for a while. As for our industry, well, we don't need any experimental facilities, which these are the things that are going to help us to actually go and produce those special projects that we want. But right now, that's not really going to matter. Especially in the case of a civil war, not many special projects are going to be able to be funded because the state is going to be trying to survive at this time. So, and that means just infrastructure or, no, civilian factories from like the very get-go. Without further ado, my friends, let's go ahead and begin and explore this. First event that we're presented with, the loyalty of the Kriegsmarine. It has come to our attention that the Kriegsmarine may opt to side with Adolf Hitler when we execute our coup. The reason seems to be their leader, Erich Rieder, has been promised by Adolf Hitler that his branch of the military will gain heavy investment and freedoms under his regime, something the old government failed to achieve. Perhaps we should make similar promises in a way or effort to sway him to our side. We must secure their loyalty at all cost, or we must not placate him. Well, as it says here, if you go to secure his loyalty, then that means that after the coup takes place and everything, once everything is done, you have to go and follow the specific path within the naval tree in order to be able to go and complete these focuses, or else he may revolt against our regime after 2 years. That is fun. While it is definitely possible in a realistic scenario that promises would be made, chances are, looking at what is going to happen on the ground, that this is not likely to happen. That the Navy is something that there is not going to be nearly as much focus on as specifically it was the Wehrmacht and the ground forces at this time that were not nearly as loyal to Hitler as what we think. Hitler's cult of personality wasn't largely built up until going into 1938, after the massive successes with Austria, with Czechoslovakia, and more. 1939... and the quick takeover of Poland and France in 1940, that is what would cement his position. Prior to that, politically, he was arguably in a much shakier position. So no, we're not going to placate him. And so here, my friends, right before things actually end up breaking out, we're going to go ahead and take our entire military, and even though this is a very well-trained force, we are going to go ahead and delete it. The argument that we will say here at this time is that largely the military refuses to stand by the mustache man, as the varying different officers that were actually operating and controlling the majority of different things around the country were not loyal, and the men are more loyal to their officers than it is that they are to the central government, especially at this time. And so here it is, March 1936, Wehrmacht officers challenge Hitler. Latent dissatisfaction with Hitler's rule has come to a head with the current crisis, caused by the administration's move to remilitarize the Rhineland. A number of Wehrmacht generals have rallied behind the well-known Field Marshal August von Mackensen, who has put in motion plans aiming to depose Hitler or to remove the Nazi Party from Germany. With the split in German high command becoming clearly apparent even abroad, foreign powers have elected not to protest against the remilitarization, more concerned with the growing internal German instability. The aging field marshal has moved quickly, already establishing a provisional government to which scores have flocked in their opposition to the Nazi government. The military coup is already well underway. Purge the Nazi scum from our lands. Yes, indeed, and that gives us the great and glorious von Mackensen in charge. Immediately from the get-go, there's a couple things we're going to do. Military high command, we're going to go ahead and get an infantry expert, since that's largely what we're going to use, and also an army organization expert. Get that started. From this point, both sides are not going to have a military. They're only going to have the basics of the paramilitary forces that actually support, the respective governments. So we're going to throw those into the fray. And then considering just how many weapons and everything that we got by going and dismissing our military, it is here then that we need to go ahead and begin to produce anything. Very quickly, military forces are going to be rallied in order to support the new government. Also, from the very get-go, you can see right here that our facility in Brandenburg was captured. That's where the experimental research facility was, and we will no longer have access to research anything until it is that any of that is taken back. So, unfortunately, that is going to go and hurt us. But still, we're presented with an opportunity for new national focuses, with the immediate one afterwards being Rally the Nation. There are many within our nation who are willing to stand up against the Nazis now that the opportunity has arrived. We should rally the people and perhaps even make contact with paramilitary organizations with experience of fighting against the Nazis ever since the days of the Weimar Republic. Paramilitary forces were actually a huge part of the Nazis' rise to power in the first place, specifically how the varying different communist elements that were destabilizing things within society were seen as a greater threat, which caused people to support the Nazis in order to fight them. That is going to be very relevant to the story that we're going to be telling here in a bit. Because expatriated communists returning home. With the recent Weimar coup against the Nazi regime, many communists who previously left the country are now flooding back in over our borders as they see the opportunity to aid in our battle against those who once wronged them. Should we allow them to fight, or should we sweep their return under the rug in hopes that they will not become popular enough to stage a revolution of their own? Yes, this was something that would be greatly destabilizing during this time, and more than likely, considering the military elements that are actually trying to overthrow the government, they are not going to want to let the communists try to do anything. So, someone needs to keep an eye on them. This is going to be relevant for later as things now begin. Immediately, small-scale skirmishes are going to break out all across the front line as the forces try and test each other's positions and what could possibly be happening. Reformation of paramilitary wings. Our politicians and generals have recently been discussing the idea of introducing paramilitary wings into the ranks of our soldiers. The conservative parties wish for the reestablishment of the Bismarck Youth, the anti-Marxist youth movement associated with the DNVP. Others, however, see the already combating Social Democratic Eisern Front as a prime organization to strengthen if we wish to use more paramilitaries within our armed forces. Yes, this is the question of whether to go with those who are anti-Marxist or potentially those that are more democratic, but from this, you may also then see a greater rise in potentially communism. No. In this path, considering how the primary goal of overthrowing Hitler, at least from the very beginning historically, the plan was to try and reestablish the Kaiser Reich. The goal was to support a monarchy. So, likely the most realistic scenario for us to work with here in the Civil War is to bring back the Kaiser, and from there, the Bismarck Youth are going to be necessary. As the new military forces are ready to spawn out, this presents us with an opportunity here to go and fight. Immediately after rallying the nation, the immediate step to stabilize the countryside would be efforts to denazify things. In order to truly rid ourselves of the Nazi disease that has infected the very heart of the German military junta, we must put extensive effort into denazifying and arresting Nazis or those who harbor them as soon as we find them out. A lot of people don't realize, but the Nazi movement was actually way smaller in Germany at this time than most people give it credit for. Like, really, it was quite small. It wasn't until later years that the party truly had consolidated such a great hold upon the country. With greater elements of the military that would be likely supporting their generals as well as commanders, this means that very quickly, after some initial fighting and forces between the paramilitaries, inroads against the Nazis would be able to be made. As the Nazis are systemically wiped, this means that the factories and things that are left behind have to very quickly be taken over and the nation tried to be rebuilt. We must focus all efforts on a rapid reconstruction if we wish to recover from ousting the Nazi blight. The people will have to live modestly and work hard in the meantime, but we will surely do so with the promise of a better tomorrow. Potentially by the summer of 1936, right as the Olympics were supposed to be happening here, mind you, Berlin would be taken. With the capture of Berlin, our troops discovered the corpse of Hitler in a bunker in the city. Choosing death over seeing anti-fascist elements take over the country, the leader evidently took his own life rather than risk capture. In his stead, Heinrich Himmler has now stepped up to lead the Nazis, and he has already affirmed that the government will not abate in their fight against the anti-German treason. However, very quickly, with the death of Hitler, so too would come the collapse of the Nazi regime. Potentially within a period of 4 to 6 months after the beginning of a civil war within Germany, things would likely be over. It would be a brutal affair, but it also is simultaneously likely to be fairly quick and short, considering that the Nazis were not nearly as popular as people give them credit for. With the end of the war, the Nazi leadership would be captured. At long last, we have freed our country from the grip of our enemies, and those loyal citizens who rose up to support our cause may now finally return to their homes. As a nation, we may begin the long and arduous process of rebuilding our nation. The country's leadership, in turn, is free to begin looking at what might come in the future, democracy, or a return to the old monarchy. One last thing remains to be taken care of, however. With the end of the Civil War, our troops have managed to capture a large group of the Nazi leadership. Now there only remains a decision as to what to actually do with them. Considering everything that has happened and considering how many purges the Nazis had launched, the chance of just imprisoning them for life and then utilizing them at a later date is very unlikely. The political elements within the military as well as the new government are not going to want any risks of the Nazis doing anything, and so they will be hung. Along with that, without the funds to really pay for them or support them and the concern about other political issues, the paramilitaries are also likely to be disbanded. The question is, at this point, what happens next? August von Mackensen will retire from the military because with victory over the Nazi menace secured, head of the military government August von Mackensen has once again decided to step back from the field command due to his age and worsening condition, and has stated that he will simply help with administrative duties from now on. As for who is actually going to step in to try and fulfill varying different roles within the government, I am sure that Hans Oster is going to be one of those people. You can already see right here that he's an anti-fascist agent. This is the guy who ended up being the head of the Abwehr, like the actual German intelligence, and for years was conspiring to take down Hitler from the inside. This is another fascinating alternate history we've explored here before of what if the Oster conspiracy had succeeded, like back when the Nazis were trying to take over Czechoslovakia. Of course, though, with a civil war, one of the key things that could happen is that varying different elements within the country may destabilize. And in this case, the Fourth Silesian Uprising, well, Silesia, this region right here, may try to get its own independence. That is not something that we are going to be able to allow. And so the first things that will then need to be done after the Civil War is that the nation will need to be revitalized, and then the future of Germany will have to be determined. After the ravages of the Civil War, we must look to rebuild our nation. We will ask the people to set aside their personal comforts for a time so that we may focus all resources on attaining this goal. Growing public dissent. With the Civil War finally at an end, we are slowly rebuilding the nation. While the people are longing for stability and security, but have a growing feeling of being adrift without an overall goal or aim, the populace is growing weary of this uncertainty and is demanding a steady course. We need to act swiftly. Yes, the question of what would happen after the war, of whether or not things are going to launch into, say, communism, democracy, monarchy, what exactly is going to happen? Well, as I already explained previously, the most likely thing to happen is that it's going to be monarchy. It's going to be monarchy specifically because that was actually the goal of a lot of the officers who wanted to overthrow Hitler in the first place, was to bring back the Kaiser Reich. This was the whole plan with the Austrian conspiracy in the first place. Whether or not it was going to be a more democratically inclined one or not is really up to question, but more than likely the Kaiser would be brought back, and specifically these conservative military elements would want to instill more power within the monarchy once again. So that means monarchist sentiment. The people want a monarchy, and that is what they will get. Though the specific form of government has not yet been decided upon, it is nonetheless clear that the German people need their Kaiser back. This is where you will then have an opportunity, once this is done, to actually go down the line of a constitutional monarchy, or actually just bringing back straight up the Kaiser. I love that they offer this as a fascinating alternate history. It's not just like straight up democracy, which seems to be unlikely to straight up work in Germany after a civil war. So the monarchy compromise is fascinating, but reviving the Kaiser Reich is its own fascinating thing that of course we have to do. The events of the past decade have shown that democracy is too weak to keep nefarious internal elements at bay. We must return to the strong leadership of a Kaiser, and in preparation for his return, we shall revert the constitution back to that of the Deutsches Kaiserreich. With the revival of the Kaiser Reich, we then have two options to determine, because again, this provides even more alternate history that we could actually work with. Do you either bring back just straight up the Kaiser, or do you kind of have the Kaiser, but the Kaiser is not the one who has the authority? It's a military dictatorship, kind of like what we would have had with Hitler, but more so what ended up happening at the end of World War I when the Kaiser had to pretty much step down. Again, this is a fascinating alternate history scenario to explore, but we're going to say in this case that the Kaiser is brought back. He is brought back fully and is actually given charge of the government. The Kaiserreich needs a Kaiser, and Wilhelm II still lives, exiled in the Netherlands. We will lift his exile and invite him to return to take the throne, despite what Western democracies might think. And so, my friends, the Kaiser returns to Germany. In the midst of ecstatic celebrations, William II has returned as Kaiser to the German Empire. The Netherlands is owed a debt of gratitude for allowing him safe refuge these past decades, and for refusing his extradition to our former enemies on multiple occasions. Though the nation has suffered much in the recent civil war, it is hoped that the Kaiser return will bring further stability and unity. He shall undoubtedly lead the nation well. Yes, my friends, the Kaiser is back. Good old Willy II. The question is, with the Kaiser back in charge, what would actually happen? Yes, if we were just playing this game straight up and actually exploring all the fun and broken things that we could do, yeah, there's a lot of different ways that we could exploit and just completely destroy everything. Yes, but realistically, what would happen? I mean, a literal civil war breaking out in Germany, and one also taking place here in Spain, is likely to make the powers of the West nervous. And though most certainly the Kaiser would not be so friendly to Germany and France, simultaneously there would be no desire to antagonize them in the same way as what had happened with Hitler. This means that rather than focusing externally, what is going to happen with the return of the Kaiser is that an internal focus will be made, fixing the economy, stabilizing the countryside, building international relations. This is going to be the primary goal of the Kaiser. First and foremost, in the aftermath of the Civil War, from all those communists that had flooded the country, they're going to need to be expatriated. They're going to need to be removed. The internal threat of communism continues to plague our nation. We must rid ourselves of it, no matter where the adherents flee to. This will give us the expatriate the communists effect, which will cause communism to decrease for 2 years. It will increase world tension, but simultaneously, it's going to cause a bunch of German communists that had come into the country after the Civil War to flee into France, which historically had its own communist issues at this time. At the same time, with less focus on rearmament and more on building the nation, the MIFO bills are no longer going to apply. They are going to be canceled, and whatever payments they have to be made at this time are going to have to be made. Will it hurt the economy? Yes, it is something that is going to punish things, but simultaneously, it's not going to be nearly as bad as it would be in, say, 2 or 3 years. There's not nearly as much debt that have been built up by this time. So those will be canceled, and though some rearmament will have taken place, it will be much lighter in this new timeline than it would in our own, and this is going to cause the Germans to have to focus on rebuilding their regular industry. With the removal of the communists, this brings up the question then of whether or not to focus on military means, to whether or not to focus on international efforts, etc., and likely some kind of international tour would be made specifically to build relations with the power around them. Yes, but more importantly than any of that, there is going to be a strong focus on internal efforts and rebuilding the nation. Of course, in this time, we've already chosen the 4-year plan versus prioritize economic growth, and the reason that we have done this here already, as we were forced to do over the course of the Civil War, is because of what is likely to happen with economic policy. See, one of the key problems that the Germans faced over the course of World War I, and this is the thing that Hitler would end up utilizing to justify his own economic plan, was that the blockades that were put in place by the Allies absolutely crippled the German state. And so autarky was pursued in an effort to make Germany independent, even though economically that never actually did work considering how broken the German war machine was. In the event that the Kaiser comes back into power and the old German conservative establishment is still in charge, what this means is that they're also likely to pursue autarky. Not aggressively, as like what Hitler had done, but still autarky is going to be pursued, so that in the event of a war breaking out, that the German state will be able to sustain itself and not be dependent upon outside powers. To that end, 2 things are going to be done in the first place. 1, autarky efforts are going to be started. For Germany to be truly great, it must be self-sufficient. We must make better use of our resources and become more efficient in our construction. And simultaneously, once that completes, internal infrastructure efforts are likely to take place, such as the construction of the Kaiserliche Autobahn. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the people are going to need to get back to work, and this is precisely what the government is going to launch: work programs. Really, at this point, there is no reason to remilitarize the state. Yes, the Kaiser is going to bring back elements of the military and is going to enter into negotiation with the Allies, but simultaneously, they're not going to rapidly militarize and try and take over the world. That's simply not realistic. In the game, yes, you can do it, and that is going to be one of the fun things that we're going to be able to explore, but simultaneously, that's not what we're going to be doing here. We're playing this realistically for how it's likely to play out. As these roads are being constructed, simultaneously, price controls are going to be launched. We must improve various measures to strengthen our control over the finances so that it won't buckle under our ambitious goals of becoming self-sufficient. We must be able to regulate the price of imports, essential goods, and workers' wages to curb inflation and secure economic stability. Almost every single thing that will be done at this time is purely economic. That is every single thing that will happen. And without a great German threat to destabilize things and force other powers to focus on remilitarization, that's probably not going to happen. It's just going to be unsteady things that are happening in the Spanish Civil War, which are not going to have the Germans interfering. The Italians still are, but not the Germans. So wage controls, rations, all these varying different things are going to be done, except for exploiting the Gombos Trade Treaty. They're not going to create any kind of hostility with Hungary, as diplomatic relations are going to be very important at this time after establishing a new state, so to speak. The important thing, though, is establishing the Kaiser work, which will allow the state to take greater control directly over finances and removing some of the outside capitalist influences. The state has to be strengthened during this time. Black shirts organizing the... What? Wait, what? Hold on. I put on the historical focus. I know I had historical focus on. What the absolute hell? Why is the UK becoming fascist? I didn't do this. All right? Okay. All right. I actually had historical focus on from the beginning. I know that I did. Like, nothing is happening with the Soviet Union. Nothing different is happening with Romania here right now. Nothing different is happening with France. It's all the same kind of things, right? Italy appears to be the same. I don't see anything else that is different. Okay, yeah, I just went back and checked my footage here. I did have historical focus on. And it still happened. Okay, this might be a bug. This might actually just straight up be a bug, but we're going to have to assume from this that Nazi elements within Germany escaped to Britain and then started to influence things from there. Oh dear God, what is happening with this game? Well, either way, with the establishment of additional factories, state-owned factories, and through furthering construction within our own empire, the thing that would naturally follow here is the concern over oil, considering that tanks are now a more common thing, as well as planes. So coal liquefaction, all these different efforts to become self-sufficient and reduce dependency upon foreign oil, that is going to happen. And meanwhile, I'm actually going to have to build up more of a military here than I anticipated, just by virtue of the fact that the frickin' UK is going fascist for some reason. Well, either way, as the middle of 1937 rolls around, further efforts can be put into industry, into research, into anything that they can think of. The German Empire is going to be brought back gloriously, and it's going to make sure that it is economically strong before it does anything else. The big thing is that the Germans wanted to create their own kind of economic bloc here and almost an idea of Middle Europa. And so in order to achieve that in the first place, as part of the 4-year plan, specifically, they're going to need to improve their own economy. And this economy is then going to be leveraged against the other powers in order to be able to, well, sustain itself. Along with this research, dams and other infrastructure, as I said, are going to be built, including the Ruhr Dam. Constructing the Ruhr Dam is more than simply a feat of engineering. It's an investment for the future. The dam would not only bolster the economic development of the region, it would also help fuel our industrial efforts and production outputs. I love this because what this did is this introduced a dam system into the game as part of like major infrastructure. So you can see right here in Belgium, there is a dam in the Ardennes, which theoretically, if you build up enough intelligence and all this other stuff, you can go and actually raid these targets and destroy them, causing permanent damage. It is truly fascinating. So here then, my friends, going into 1938, considering what it is that is happening within the UK and possible hostilities that could be breaking out elsewhere, that even in the midst of this general or smaller rearmament as well as greater industrial efforts, that this is where it is likely that the German Empire will begin to look outwards with realpolitik. The time has come for us to look outward at the rest of Europe and see in which direction the winds are blowing. If the opportunities for alliances or conquest arise, we must make sure to take hold of them immediately. The immediate first step for this, then, is to rebuild the German Empire to its glory days, specifically to bring it back to the state that it was and get the states that it did have under control again, which are largely controlled by Poland here in this regard. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be hostile against Poland. No, in fact, what's interesting is that historically here at this time, Poland was actually relatively friendly to Germany, really right up until being invaded, and the same kind of thing is going to happen. So the idea of moving over here to restore the Brest-Litovsk borders at the end of World War I and having Germany go and just outright go on a warpath to try and destroy Poland is unlikely. No, Instead, they would see to the Eastern Front and specifically try to build relations, because at this point, with a weakened empire after a civil war and years of issues, they're not going to be really in a position that this is going to be probable. You could do this when you actually play the game, and if you go and use my link to go and buy the game here, I actually get a cut of that. So if you want to support this channel without actually just straight up giving me money, and you still want to play the game, you should definitely go and do that. But either way, that's the more realistic path for us to go and pursue. I love this DLC so far because I just love all the different variants. You have so many different opportunities, whether you're going to do something peacefully or through war or everything else. It gives so many more options. In seeing to the Eastern Front, the likely thing that would happen is that Poland would not be dealt with aggressively. Instead, they would try to seek control of Danzig and the eastern territories that the Empire had in exchange for guarantees. The Soviet Union was far more active during this time, and there was a very real risk. The Polish did not trust anything that was happening to their east, and they were questionable about what could be happening to the west with Germany. So there is a decent chance that if, as an example, Germany had gone and offered help to Poland in investing in it, in protecting it, that some territory would be given up specifically to protect themselves. The Poles surely must feel the danger of the Bolsheviks. Perhaps we can come to an agreement regarding the return of Danzig, Poznan, and the Silesian voivodeship in exchange for guarantees of military support in case of an invasion from the Reds. The other fascinating thing to take note of here at this time, which I'm not actually going to properly be able to show because I don't want to abuse that here right now, is that military training actually increases world tension. So if you've noticed here, I haven't trained any of these units that I've just been building up over this time. The reason for that is because when you start launching military exercises, this drives up world tension. And theoretically, that doesn't really matter for me right now here, but you can see, latest change, military exercises. The more that you do this, the more that it drives up tension because people are afraid that, oh, that is going to cause people to think that an attack is about to happen. It's fascinating. I love it. April of 1938, Poland goes and accepts the offer. The Poles have decided to accept our offer and have made arrangements to transfer their border to provinces to us. They put their faith in us and urge us to stand ready in case of Soviet aggression. This is beautiful. In doing so, the German Empire has been almost entirely brought back to the state that it was before. The step that would be taken after this, though, is the arguable final immediate step that would need to be done. And I say that final immediate, it doesn't really make much sense how I'm phrasing it, but the territory that is left to take to return the German Empire to what it was is the return of southern Jutland. The ownership of the Duchy of Schleswig has long been a contentious matter between us and the Danes. At the end of the Great War, despite not even taking part in it, the Entente gave northern Schleswig away to them. We must undo this historical injustice and demand the Danish government hand it back to us. This would be the final step, and considering the state of the German military by this time, they more than likely would end up agreeing to this, particularly if relations are improved and simultaneously after this, enough diplomatic pressure is placed upon them. Denmark caves to our demands. Thorvald Stunning has declared that, seeing as they do not wish to enter armed conflict against us, they have opted for giving back the territory gained in the 1920 Schleswig plebiscites. The people of the region rejoice as they have once again been brought back into the fold, and this is a great day for the German people. Is it much? No, it's literally just a single little territory here that doesn't really offer anything of note, but it is important that Germany gets its territory back, and at this point, there is no actual desire for expansion. This is the point that I've been trying to make in here. Yes, you could theoretically abuse this game to high hell and go and invade just about everything, but as it stands, within a couple years, thanks to diplomatic and economic efforts, we have rebuilt the German Empire. From here, it is unlikely that Germany would go on any strong offensive measures. They wouldn't try to take over the world or anything like that. Instead, Mitteleuropa and a strong economic bloc would likely be built. The main interest area of the German people is in Middle Europe, initially being envisioned by the Prussians as pan-Germanist, state-centric imperium. These ideas could use some polishing, but are a good base on which we can build the new order in Europe. The question, though, is at this time, Austria had a very strong fascist lean to it. This was something that was always a question and more than likely would result in, well, as you can see in here, the fascists taking over the government, but it being a different form. The Austrians were more closely allied with the Italians, and the idea of that being on the border, particularly after a civil war, would likely be seen as a great threat. As such, many efforts would be tried to be made in order to sway the Austrians to our side. Would they outright try to annex the Austrians? No. This is something that specifically Hitler wanted, and maybe a number of people within the Nazis, or maybe even some conservative elements wanted, but this is unlikely to be strongly desired by the Kaiser Reich. Instead, no, support is going to be trying to give to varying different monarchist factions within Austria in order to try and build up a stronger southern neighbor to secure the border. Our Austrian brothers fought hard together with us as part of the Central Powers. We should reach out to them in an offer they can't say no to, so that we can once again fight side by side. The federal state of Austria accepts our offer. Kurt Schuschnigg of the federal state of Austria has responded favorably to our offer, and their diplomats have arrived in our nation to sign the necessary documents to facilitate their full entry into Middle Europa. They would gladly take our aid in reclaiming the old Austro-Hungarian lands, and wish to once again fight side by side as brothers against the world. Austria joins Middle Europa. This is beautiful, and this is likely the efforts that would specifically be undertaken in order to be able to secure monarchist elements, being at this point the German Empire is really the only strong monarchy, because yes, the Italian government being fascist has actually been controlled by Mussolini since the 1920s, so really Germany would be on its own and would likely be trying to build as many relations as they could. French, oh dear God. Yeah, so remember all those communists that were kicked out of Germany in the aftermath of the Civil War? They would likely, as I said, flee to France, as it shows here, which would in turn result in the communists taking over the government of France. That is a very real possibility of that happening, because the communists were already one of the most powerful blocs within the country, and if they got a surge in numbers because of the Germans flooding in, yeah, that probably would have changed things here. Shit. This would create even greater cause for concern. Maybe that is actually one of the key reasons as to why the UK even is going fascist in the first place, is as a response to communist elements rising within the world. In order to mitigate this, Germany would have to prepare itself, and from there, instead of trying to carve up its neighbors, would instead try to align them, such as aligning Czechoslovakia. Austria then immediately left the faction because they're fascist, and they... Well, that's annoying. Even though that happened, I guess we need to first rekindle imperial sentiments in the first place in order to try and get them back into the fold. After doing so, Czechoslovakia would be aligned. The Czechoslovak state is rich in industrial capabilities and natural resources, having been one of the heartlands of industrialization in Austria-Hungary. We should have them join Middle Europa so that we can make use of their riches. Considering the state of the world and what is happening, the Czechoslovak Republic would likely accept our offer. Edward Benda seems to be a reasonable leader who is looking out for his country's best interest. Coincidentally, this just so happens to be in our country's best interest as well. We will put the extra resources from Czechoslovakia to good use. With the establishment of Middle Europa, likely a customs union would also be established. Autarky, which is being utilized by us, is not just a matter of the nation being self-sufficient, but also within specifically the allies and spheres of influence, not being dependent upon outside powers that could potentially be hostile. But if they are part of our faction, this isn't nearly as much of a problem. As were the plans in the September program of old, we should now establish the Middle Europa Customs Union and slowly but surely unite the European economies into one most powerful force. We're gonna make the EU, baby. In the aftermath of this, and in order to secure our southern front, the Balkans will need to be swayed. There are many nations of the Balkans who feel threatened by foreign powers. We should offer them a place in Middle Europa so that our union can grow even stronger. Bulgaria seeks Balkan claims warranted? Well, this is possible. A delegation from the Tsardom of Bulgaria has approached our government asking the German support for their claims in the Balkans and seeking to secretly negotiate and secure Bulgarian territorial expansion in the region in the near future, in exchange for the Bulgarian alignment with the German Empire and the country's entry into Middle Europa. Yes, this is likely to be granted, specifically with pressure by the Germans being placed among different Balkan states, in this case Yugoslavia, to align it. Along with this, with Poland secured to the east, it simultaneously makes sense that offers of support would be granted to the Baltic. Now, whether or not tribute would be asked specifically for this, which is something that ultimately would hurt the Baltic states a little bit, but guarantee them, it is possible, but considering how Germany at this time would be trying to actually build an alliance with varying different central powers, it doesn't make sense that they would want to be too overbearing, because in doing so, it would make the other entities within the government, within the alliance, potentially hostile. So safeguard the Baltic. The Baltics were a part of the Russian Empire until a few decades ago, and it stands to reason the Soviets may once again try to annex them. We must prevent this and offer our military support in case of Soviet invasion. Bulgaria goes and joins Middle Europa, and also at the same time, relations are improved with Yugoslavia, Romania, and potentially Hungary in order to get them into the fold as well. Yugoslavia accepts, Greece accepts, and Romania accepts. So here we are then, January of 1939. Middle Europa is an extremely strong faction. Guarantees have already been offered to Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which effectively creates a bulwark against the Soviets. This alliance is likely to be further strengthened through varying different research efforts as well as building up of defenses. Economically, though, the people would probably be in one of the greatest positions they possibly could. With the establishment of an Eastern Bulwark build, likely the extension of Middle Europa would be extended even further eastward. The nations to our east are more than just buffer states. We should invite them into Middle Europa and ensure that they help grow our alliance and customs union even stronger. Poland accepts our offer, Estonia accepts, Lithuania accepts, Latvia accepts. At this point in time, Germany would be living the high life. The actual extent of Middle Europa, minus Austria, which that whole thing stupidly happened because, of course, they're just fascists, so immediately left, but we're fixing that, don't worry, means that now more than ever, the economy of Central Europe is strongly integrated, allowing for autarky to truly flourish. Trade agreements would naturally be set up between all the varying different powers, and from that, economically, they would begin to be integrated. Reunification of Austria-Hungary. With our support, the Archduchy of Austria has taken the lead in reunification of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Treaties between the involved parties were signed this morning, undoing 2 decades of separatist sentiment. The new unified government immediately pledged their military support to our cause, becoming a member of the Central Powers. Is this playing out realistically? Probably not, but considering how it is that the world would have destabilized, and with the threats of communism on both sides, from both the French and simultaneously from the Soviets, it means that perhaps these central forces would specifically be more inclined to align themselves with Germany. The question is then, what happens with Italy? After all, we have fascism to the south, and now at this point, Britain would be going fascist. Do we align ourselves with the fascist in common cause against communist threat, or do we remove the possible threat to the south and conquer them? Well, at this point in time, an actual war is unlikely, particularly as the military has been sidelined for years in preparation, or rather, in order to build up the economy. As such, that is unlikely to happen. Instead, greater economic efforts would be made to integrate the different economies. And defenses are going to be built. But first and foremost, the last thing that needs to be done is specifically that the Finns are going to be guaranteed. The Finns find themselves in the firing line of the Soviets. We will offer them a guarantee against the Eastern threat and give them some modest industrial aid. In doing so, a true Middle European faction is created. The question is then, what will happen next? It is mid-1939, this is right at the time that World War II broke out in our own timeline, and at this point, the German Empire is arguably more powerful than it has ever been. Through concerted efforts to unite the varying different lands of Central Europe behind them, they are perhaps not as militarily strong as they would have been, but economically, they are vastly superior and more stable than what they otherwise would be. While no war would be launched, defensive efforts would still be made, and specifically in order to prepare against possible Soviet aggression, elements within the long-dead Russian White movement would be reached out to, and from here, any potential aggressive actions by Russia would allow Germany to create their own kind of compliant force within the lands that they possibly invade. There are many Russians who fled abroad after the Reds won the Russian Civil War. We should reach out to them and see if they are willing to cooperate in the recapture of their homeland at the cost of having to give up any claims to the lands given to us or our allies in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Canada declares, yes, okay, so with the fact that the fascists took over the government within Britain, this means that in the aftermath of that, the varying different powers around the world have now declared independence. Fun. End of the League. The Soviet Union has declared war upon Estonia. Yes, with the declaration of war on Estonia by the Soviet Union, the League of Nations has failed in any attempt to preserve peace. Joseph Stalin openly mocked the League's inability to do anything, and with that took his country out of the League. Yes, the reality of the situation is that the Soviets would not appreciate what was going on here in Middle Europe. They would see the taking of Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and all the varying different Baltic and Central states here into the alliance of Middle Europa as a threat to their very existence, and would likely, before it is that the alliance could build up even greater and become even more integrated, launch some kind of strike. Naturally, the call to arms would be accepted. Germany would stand against the Soviets. And in doing so, a grand alliance would be brought against them. Very quickly, things on the front would likely devolve into a kind of stalemate. After years of focus on economic matters rather than military matters, the Germans would not necessarily be in a position where they were absolutely prepared for this fight, but simultaneously, the Soviets would be horribly backwards, meaning small little incursions would be made on the east, and from there, more incompetent Soviet forces would likely eventually be rolled up. The biggest problem for the German Empire in this new timeline is that because of the influx of, well, the communists that went to France, this likely would mean that France would go and join the Comintern. In doing so, this means that the Germans would be forced to send some of their forces west in order to be able to hold back the French. With this outward Soviet aggression, it is very likely that varying different elements within the Nordic countries would be reached out to, and from here, potentially they may also join Middle Europa as well. The whole reason why that happens is that it is likely at this time that in order to be able to secure a greater front and protect St. Petersburg, or I say St. Petersburg, Leningrad, the Soviets would also likely take efforts against Finland, which in turn would cause them to join the war. Yes, the German Empire would not have been as militarily strong as perhaps the fascists were in this time, but simultaneously they are greater in terms of diplomacy, and through the sheer effort of uniting so many peoples behind them, this would enable them to be able to take the fight to the Soviets, particularly if the Soviets would throw themselves at the front line for a while, further softening and weakening their efforts. Quite simply put, the Soviet Union would be stretched thin. And though this would result in horrendous casualties for the central, well, not central powers, Middle Europa, simultaneously, the numbers themselves would be greater. With a nation once at war again, this means that the Landwehr would be established. The Landwehr have been a useful self-defense tool ever since 1813, and have been very useful for the Weimar Republic. We should also endeavor to make the men of our nation useful and establish our own Landwehr and Landschützen battalions. Yes. The question of what would happen internationally at this point is questionable. After all, the British would be focused on their own kind of domestic affairs and trying to reclaim their empire and would not be able to intervene on this side, and the Italians have no reason to intervene themselves. They would likely not ally themselves with the Soviets in order to be able to take out the Germans from the south, as the idea of going against the potential alliance, even if it could be something lucrative for them, would be questionable. Instead, more likely, at this point, while fighting in the east is happening, the Germans would reach out to the Italians to align with them and potentially offer them French lands for compensation. Though additional efforts would likely be made to launch attacks into Romania or others, considering the sheer force of what would be arrayed against them, eventually hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of Soviet men would be caught and encircled. Eventually, as the harsh winter rolls away, this means that the Soviet Union, which potentially would have had a slight advantage at that time, potentially, would have faced something significantly worse than the Finnish winter. They would have faced a winter invading everything across Eastern Europe, and from there suffered horrendous casualties. As summer rolled around, this would allow the Allied forces, I say Allied forces, Middle European forces, to move rapidly into the east. In fact, losses would be so great by this time, with so many varying different peoples and elements within the White Army even rising up, that it is very possible at this point that the Soviet Union would just straight up collapse. From this happening, the forces that were directed east would be able to move west, and with that, be able to fairly easily take out the French. The sheer number of men, equipment, and material that would move along the Maginot would likely take even these impenetrable defenses and break them. In doing so, Europe falls. The result of this, then, is more than likely a couple things. The German Empire is not going to try and take territory at this time. It's not going to be Lebensraum as we think of it. No, instead, Alsace-Lorraine would, of course, be taken back. That is something that the German Empire is going to desire. Along with this, it is possible that a buffer state will be set up or additional territory that is taken in French Comté, and the remaining territory within France puppeted. Naturally, the communists would not be allowed to remain in power. Instead, the French would have to reestablish some kind of legitimate government, and from there be subservient to the German state. The remaining French territory in Africa would of course be seized by the German Empire, which would reestablish its colonial holdings. Yes, it would not get nearly as many as it had, or rather, would not get the territory that it had in our own timeline, but in taking the French colonies, this would vastly improve the German state. The Kaiser would get his empire back again. Ultimately, the results of what would likely happen in this scenario would be a complete fragmentation and destruction of Russia itself. There would be no Russian state. Instead, what would likely end up happening is that the varying different territories would be divided so as the previous treaty, the Brest-Litovsk, or I'm butchering the pronunciation of it, that nothing like this would ever happen again. Austria-Hungary would likely take over management of varying different territories in the east, while the other varying entities would be established as puppet states under the control of Middle Europa. Ultimately, in the end, in this new timeline, should things actually work out, the German Empire reigns supreme, and all by the year of 1940, going into 1941. Dear God, holy crap, this is so broken and powerful. Oh my God. I was trying to play this historical. And be realistic with this, and yet the game just went, you know what? Let's break everything. Let's create cancer. So yeah, That was awesome, and I didn't even get to do like 80% of the stuff for the focus tree, because even with everything that I did, and I did a lot, there are still so many focuses left to do. I didn't even do a single focus for warfare or for Air Force. Not a single one. I literally just did economy the entire game. Well, my friends, with that, I think that we're going to go ahead and end things here today. This, my friends, is the new DLC. We didn't even get to explore all the different features. We didn't get to explore all the varying different things with experimental facilities. This DLC is so full of content that honestly, just what it has created is going to be next to impossible for me to very easily create stories with in the future. Which, don't get me wrong, while frustrating, I love it because there's now so many more things for me to have to balance when telling a story. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you all would honestly like to see next, because the reality of this in this alternate history is that the German Empire is not going to wage war against Italy. They're not going to wage war against the British Empire. They're not going to do any of that. Instead, at this point, they would focus likely on their own internal relations and specifically maintaining and building up the economy. The German Empire would be a massive success at this point in history, I guess. Either way, that's the end of things as they are. Thank you all very much, my friends, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye, guys.